How was Mexico formed? What were the first civilizations created here? Why did the Spaniards come to these lands, take them by force, and why couldn't the natives resist? How was the colony of New Spain mismanaged? How did it fight for independence? And how did the new country of Mexico lose more than 50% of its territory? To understand the history of Mexico, from the first human societies to the modern day, we have to go back to the very beginning. Mexico's history began at least 10,000 years ago, when the evidence of the first human settlers in the region can be found. The earliest known human remains in Mexico are of the Tepexpan man, found beneath modern Mexico City. He was a hunter-gatherer who was buried alongside mammoth bones around 8000 BC. Hunter-gatherers like him probably first arrived in Mexico from the north, where they spread out and lived nomadic lives for thousands of years. The first settlements didn't appear until around 1800 BC, and the key to their existence was maize. Maize, or corn, was the staple food of pre-colonial Mexico, and the majority of people who lived there for the next 3,000 years would have oriented their lives around farming it. Ancient Mexicans also grew a wide range of other crops, like beans, tomatoes, squash, and cocoa, the latter of which they famously made into a bitter drink, and raised animals like turkeys for meat. There were no draft animals like horses, which means there was little need to invent wheels. Mexico did have them. They've been found on ancient children's toys, but they were never used for anything practical like wagons. Mexico also didn't practice iron or bronze working. Instead, the chief material for weapons and tools was obsidian, a volcanic glass which can hold an edge sharper than modern surgical steel. The earliest settled societies were villages or small towns. To find the first suburban civilization, we have to go to the Olmecs. Emerging on the northern Mexican coast, in the modern states of Veracruz and Tabasco, the Olmecs appeared on the scene around 1200 BC. They're credited with the first true cities of Mexico, and its earliest monumental architecture. The best-known relics of the Olmec are certainly the massive stone heads, some standing almost 3 meters tall and weighing several tons, which are believed to depict the most powerful Olmec rulers. The Olmecs were also the first Mexican civilization to develop writing. While this language still hasn't been deciphered, scholars have found enough glyphs inscribed on monuments and pottery to be confident that the Olmec had a developed writing system, and it most likely was the inspiration for later Mexican languages and scripts. Another feature of pre-colonial Mexico that appeared under the Olmec was the Mesoamerican ball game. The Mesoamerican ball game is a catch-all word for what was probably multiple games played with similar equipment throughout history. The rules varied by time and place, but the basic idea was that players would hit a ball between each other, using only their feet or hips, and try to score points against the other. The ball game was a major feature of life in pre-colonial Mexico. Ball courts could be found in most major cities, and numerous statues and carvings depict ball players themselves. Ball games were major social events, not unlike gladiator fights in Rome, or football games today, and they could even take on a religious aspect. Later Maya legends speak of the hero twins, Unapu and Xablanque, defeating the lords of the underworld in a ball game, and sometimes the losing teams in a game were sacrificed. The Olmecs would be the first great Mexican civilization, but hardly the last. By 700 BC, they'd been joined by the Zapotecs of southern Mexico, with their great center at Monte Alban, who shared recognizable systems of language, architecture, agriculture, and more that shows a diverse but related network of civilization was emerging across Mexico. Teotihuacan and the early classic. The decline of the Olmecs by 300 BC, probably due to climate changes, signaled a new age of Mexican history. This classical period saw many of Mexico's greatest cities and civilizations, chief among which was the city of Teotihuacan. Beginning from around 100 BC, Teotihuacan was the largest city yet seen in the pre-colonial Americas. Laid out on an octagonal urban plain, it covered 8 square miles of land, and probably housed over 100,000 people at its height in the 4th and 5th centuries. Many of the people of Teotihuacan lived in family apartments, where they shared communal and economic space, rather than having individual huts or houses. The city was also a center of trade and crafts, where foreign goods came in, and Teotihuacan's goods flowed out along trade routes that connected the city across the breadth of the Mesoamerica and beyond, with the traces of Teotihuacan's trade being found all the way up in the southwestern United States. The city's name literally means the place where one becomes a god, and later Mexican cultures invested it with all sorts of religious significance. Teotihuacan surpassed any other city of its day in its monumental architecture, with its skyline dominated by 3 massive pyramids dedicated to the gods. The Pyramid of the Sun was dedicated to the storm god Tlaloc, the Pyramid of the Moon to an unnamed great goddess, and the Pyramid of the Feathered Serpent dedicated to the eponymous deity common to many later Mexican cultures, but who is best known as the Aztec Quetzalcoatl. Human sacrifices would have been performed at some of these pyramids at religious ceremonies. Teotihuacan's powerful influence on the rest of Mexico was owed to economic, spiritual, and military power. By the 4th century AD, it was undoubtedly the greater power in Mexico, with its armies venturing farther afield to collect tribute and glory for the city. For example, they conquered several powerful Maya cities in the Yucatan, including Tikal and Copan, making theirs the farthest-reaching empire in pre-colonial Mexican history. However, there's still much we don't know about the Teotihuacan. We don't know if it had a single ruling king, or perhaps was run by a council representing the different social classes of the city. The extent, nature, and even the very existence of its foreign military expeditions is also a matter of debate. So too is its end. Like the Olmecs, climate factors probably played a role, but we also know that sometime in the late 6th century, the city witnessed incredible amounts of violence, with many of its great monuments burnt down, its elite homes ransacked, and its pottery smashed and forgotten in the ruins. Perhaps it was invaded by a rival, or it might have been an internal rebellion. Whatever the cause, Teotihuacan's glory days faded, but as one people fell, another rose in their place. The Maya and the Late Classic. The Maya inhabited areas of eastern Mexico and the Yucatan, stretching into modern-day Guatemala and Honduras. The Maya emerged as a distinct people as early as the 8th century BCE, and were known to have interacted with the Olmecs and Zapotecs. By Teotihuacan's day, Maya cities in the Yucatan were trading on good terms, and there were Maya communities in Teotihuacan itself. The 7th century marked the start of the Maya classical age, where the Maya rose to be the preeminent people of Mesoamerica. To be clear, there was never a unified Maya empire, nor really a unified Maya people. Maya is a broad category that includes several subcultures and languages that share influences in history. Politically, the classical Maya were organized into kingdoms and city-states. Some of the larger cities would exert significant influence on surrounding cities and expect obedience from lesser rulers. But for the most part, each Maya city-state and kingdom ruled itself. 2 of the largest cities were Calakmul in the modern Campeche state, ruled by a dynasty dubbed the Snake Kings, and Tikal, its powerful rival to the south in modern Guatemala. Calakmul and Tikal sustained an intense rivalry for over 2 centuries that culminated in a series of conflicts between the 6th and 8th centuries. We can date these wars and other events in Maya history thanks to one of their greatest inventions, the calendar. The Maya long count calendar was developed early in Maya civilization and was shared by most Maya peoples. They used the calendar to schedule religious ceremonies, plan agriculture, chart the stars, and catalog key events. For example, King Pakal of Palenque assumed the throne on precisely July 27th, 615, and died on August 29th, 683, giving him a reign of exactly 68 years and 33 days, making him the 5th longest reigning monarch in world history. The Maya suffered a significant collapse around 900 CE that saw many major cities like Tikal and Palenque abandoned, and there was a sharp drop-off in artistic and architectural work. Scholars have traditionally attributed this to environmental factors, such as a massive drought caused by climate change, or overworked soil, but the exact cause remains a mystery. The Maya didn't totally vanish, though. Life shifted away from cities like Tikal, Calakmul, and Palenque, and moved to smaller towns or villages instead. But there were new cities like Chichen Itza, which emerged long after the classical period had come to a close. While the Maya never returned to the same level of urbanization, political complexity, or monument building as they had in their classical years, they remain a proud and living people to this day. The Toltecs. But beyond the Maya, the 9th century saw the collapse or decline of societies across Mexico, suggesting widespread effects from climate change, disease, drought, invasion, and/or social unrest. It was in this period of change and unrest that a new power emerged in the form of the Toltecs of Tula. According to later Mesoamerican sources, the Toltecs were a powerful militaristic empire, but they were also unrivaled in architecture, trade, and the arts. Most of northern and central Mexico, and even the Yucatan, fell under their sway between the 10th and 12th centuries. Even more so than most ancient Mexican people, though, the Toltecs are something of an enigma to modern scholars. Archaeological evidence of this post-classical empire is sketchy at best, and not nearly as extensive as we would expect, given the later stories about them. We know they spoke the Nahuatl language, shared by the later Aztecs, but elaborate accounts of their conquest from the Aztecs also can't be verified, and they are filled with the appearance and direct intervention of the gods. Supposedly, the Toltecs fell when civil war ripped Tula apart in the 1150s, and soon only the ruins and tales of their glory remained. Modern scholars take later accounts of the Toltecs with a grain of salt. Later Mexican societies treated the Toltecs as an almost mythical predecessor, whose power they supposedly inherited, and these tales were probably exaggerated by later sources. If one group was most responsible for the idolization of the Toltecs, it had to be the Aztecs. According to their own legends, the Aztecs hailed from a distant land far to the northwest, and were led to Mexico in the 12th century by their god, Huitzilopochtli. When they reached the shores of Lake Texcoco, they saw an eagle eating a snake upon a cactus, and knew this was the site of their new capital, Tenochtitlan. They assumed a new name, the Mexica, and thus began the story of the Aztecs in Mexico. Certainly, the Aztecs were foreign migrants, but their tale of arriving and planting a city on a divinely ordained spot is an exaggeration. They actually spent their first few centuries as a lesser power, struggling to establish their legitimacy among the numerous existing peoples in the Valley of Mexico. It is this craving for legitimacy that probably explains the Aztecs' veneration of the Toltecs, as they tried to emulate and appropriate the last great power of the region. By 1428, though, the Aztecs had established 3 powerful cities of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan to form a triple alliance. With the death of the ruler of the local Aztec Empire, to which the Aztecs were forced to pay tribute, the Triple Alliance seized the opportunity to overthrow their masters and assume an imperial dominance of their own. Nominally, the 3 cities were all equal, but the ruler of Tenochtitlan was clearly the dominant force. He served as the Aztec Emperor, or Tlatoani, and Tenochtitlan was by far the largest city in Mexico, and one of the largest anywhere in the world at the time. Tenochtitlan was an impressive city of artificial islands, intersected by canals, and adorned with monuments and pyramids in the Mesoamerican style. Some of these pyramids, like the Huitzilopochtli, were the site of the most infamous part of Aztec life: human sacrifices. The Aztecs believed that Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun, needed human blood to stay strong. Sacrifices could be willing or forced, but all would be led to the top of the pyramid, where a priest would cut out their heart with an obsidian knife, and then dismember the body. In some cases, parts of the victim were eaten. Human sacrifice was not unknown in other Mesoamerican cultures, but it is best known from the Aztecs. Over the next few decades, Aztec armies marched out and subdued numerous cities in the surrounding area. As their power grew, they compelled more cities to bend the knee, until their empire stretched beyond the Valley of Mexico, claiming the obedience of around 500 cities or towns by 1519. The Aztecs ruled a sort of tributary empire. They didn't send governors out to rule cities. They didn't set up an imperial bureaucracy, and they didn't build roads or fortresses to connect and control their empire. They demanded tribute in the form of food, gold, and other commodities, and sometimes in human sacrifices. As long as these were given, the cities were mostly left alone to run themselves. It was this empire that Hernán Cortés heard of when he made landfall at Veracruz on April 22nd, 1519. The Spanish marched inland, where they made contact with the various cities who made up the Aztec Empire. Both parties were intrigued, confused, and horrified by the other. Some cities chose to be diplomatic to the strangers. Others chose to resist. Cortés used their resistance as proof of their pagan wickedness and punished those who opposed him. The city of Cholula was one such resistant example, so Cortés sacked the city, massacred its population, and burned many of its buildings to the ground. Nevertheless, on November 19, 1519, the Aztec ruler Montezuma II met Cortés outside Tenochtitlan, where the two men exchanged pleasantries, and Montezuma invited Cortés to stay in his city. Later histories have judged Montezuma as a fool for inviting Cortés into his capital and housing the Spanish for the next few months. However, it must be considered that Tenochtitlan was where the Aztecs could best keep an eye on the Spanish, and it was where most of their manpower was concentrated. Better have them there than roaming about Mexico. Eventually, perhaps inevitably, the Spanish seized the upper hand. They placed Montezuma under a sort of house arrest. Reportedly, he remained on good terms with his captors. During the Feast of Toxcatl in May 1520, a massacre committed by the Spanish turned the population against them. The Spanish were practically besieged in the city, and when Montezuma went out to calm the crowds, he was either struck by a rock thrown or executed by the Spanish, depending on the source. The Spanish were forced to flee the city in what became known as La Noche Triste, losing hundreds of men and much of the treasure they had gathered. However, the Aztecs had made plenty of enemies through their imperial dominance. In May 1521, Cortés returned with his 1,000 conquistadors and tens of thousands of Mexican allies. After a 10-week siege, the Spanish broke into the city, killed its warriors, and tore down the shrines of the Aztec gods. The fall of the city was bloody and chaotic. It was a symbolic end to the age of pre-colonial Mexican civilization. In the words of one Nahuatl poet after the conquest, "Broken spears lie in the roads. We have torn our hair in our grief. The houses are roofless now, and their walls are red with blood." With the fall of the Aztecs, Mexico entered a new age of Spanish colonial dominance. Its society, religion, economy, and demographics would transform forever. The defeat of the Aztecs was far from the end of Spain's long quest to capture Mexico. Decades of warfare and settlement was needed to complete it. To do this, they needed a center of power, Mexico City. Founded upon the ruins of Tenochtitlan, the Spanish demolished many of the existing Aztec structures, and in time filled in Lake Texcoco to create artificial land for the city. A similar pattern of turning existing native cities into Spanish colonial centers continued across most of Mexico. In 1535, these new settlements were reorganized into a new colonial administrative structure, known as the Viceroyalty of New Spain, headquartered in Mexico City, with a single unified government ruling over them. The Spanish continued their conquest of Mexico after 1521. The Zapotecs and the Mixtecs of the Oaxaca Valley submitted quickly. The Maya of the Yucatan Peninsula proved far less easy to control. The difficult terrain, the fierce guerrilla resistance of the Maya, and a lack of gold or silver to motivate conquistadors meant that most of the Yucatan remained unconquered well into the 1540s, and pockets of resistance lingered well into the 17th century. The most fierce resistance came in north-central Mexico, first from the Cascan, whose resistance to the Spanish during the Mixton War from 1540 to 1542 inflicted Spanish casualties comparable to the original Conquest. After them, the Chichimeca became the most stubbornly resistant of the indigenous people. Between 1550 and 1590, the Chichimeca forced Spain to undertake its longest continual colonial war, and, in the end, the Spanish were never able to crush them militarily. The war ended with a series of negotiated settlements that reduced Spanish troop and missionary presence in Chichimeca territory and built cooperative relations with the Chichimeca leaders. Ultimately, the Chichimeca settled and slowly assimilated to Spanish and Catholic culture anyway, but they did so on terms that were much more their own than some other native peoples were allowed. Controlling Mexico required the cooperation of surviving native elites. In the years after the conquests, many of the leading figures of pre-colonial Mexica society became the cooperative elites of the new colonial Mexican age. They were taught Spanish, and their children were raised as Spanish-speaking Christians. In exchange, they kept their local power and got favorable treatment from the Spanish. Some of these Spanish-speaking indigenous peoples would pen the only surviving native accounts of the conquest, although they were heavily filtered through their new Spanish lens. For Spain, empire meant wealth and faith above all. Missionaries were quick on the heels of the conquerors, with many religious figures of the day believing that the opening of the missionary field in the Americas was the final step towards the second coming of Jesus Christ. The Franciscans were the first to arrive in Mexico, starting in 1524, with the Dominicans arriving in 1536, and the Jesuits in 1572. While the orders differed on some particulars, there were some similarities in their attitudes. All believed the native religion was savage, but the Mexicans themselves were merely ignorant, almost childlike. The missionaries firmly believed that proper instruction in Christianity would build a respectable Christian society out of the natives. Missionaries focused first on the destruction of non-Christian influences, like temples and idols, and then on making new converts. For example, the Dominican missionary Diego de Landa, who worked among the Maya in the 1560s and 1570s, he oversaw the torture of around 4,000 Maya people and the deaths of around 170 for the crimes of idolatry and paganism, along with the total destruction of countless Maya books, which he condemned as pagan nonsense. The exact approach was often debated. Missionaries were constantly concerned that Mexicans were not truly understanding Christianity, and there was too much focus on the quantity of baptized Christians, rather than the quality of them. Much of the European understanding of Mexican languages, like Nahuatl, and of the Mexicans' early understanding of Spanish, came through missionaries, as they attempted to bring Christianity to the Mexicans in terms they'd be able to understand. Of course, all of this occurred in the context of massive Mexican population decline. In the decades after the conquest, native population steadily declined, from around 25 million in 1519 to less than 1 million by 1622. Still, natives significantly outnumbered the Spanish for a long time. By 1550, for example, Mexico City was still made up of about 90% native Mexicans. That number dwindled with the arrival of new Spanish settlers, African slaves, and the mestizo children of European and Mexican parents. While settlement and conversion were important parts of Spanish imperialism, the lust for gold and wealth were no less important in shaping colonial Mexico. The silver mines of the Zacatecas region, and later gold in the Sonora region, were the single most valuable areas of Mexico, and much Spanish effort was put into the extraction and shipment of these resources back to Europe. Although Peru would outstrip Mexico in the production of both valuable metals, Mexican gold and silver mines remained an invaluable source of wealth through the colonial period. The economic lifeblood of early colonial Mexico was the encomienda. The encomienda was essentially the right to the labor of natives that was awarded to Spanish conquistadors and settlers. Under the encomienda, natives were forced to labor for their Spanish masters, in terms not far shy of chattel slavery. Most encomienda work was farming or plantation related, on estates known as haciendas. But encomienda laborers could also be found working in the gold and silver mines in large numbers. The encomienda system was first used in Mexico by Cortés as a reward for his conquistadors. For the first few decades of Spanish rule, it was a vital but controversial economic institution. Most of the early Spanish colonial elite relied upon it, and it gave individual encomenderos significant local power. Critics of the encomienda system called it a cruel and unjust institution, no better than slavery. The Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas was among the fiercest critics of Spanish colonial methods, condemning the encomienda as a moral pestilence which daily consumes these people, and decrying the horrible treatment of native peoples. He still believed in Spain's imperial right to the New World. He simply wanted Spain's imperialism to be conducted more morally. Concerns about the ethics of the encomienda and the unrestrained power of the encomenderos led King Charles V to more tightly control them with the new laws of 1542. The encomienda system gradually died out over the second half of the 16th century and was replaced with a new repartimiento system. It was slightly fairer in that it rotated labor demands between native communities and offered at least a paltry wage. Ultimately, demographics would reshape the economy. As native populations declined, encomienda and repartimiento were less viable. African slaves began being imported in greater numbers, mostly by trading for them with the Portuguese, or later the British. Hand in hand with this, the growth of the Spanish settler and mestizo populations increased the availability of paid labor. As the 17th century progressed, paid labor supplanted forced native labor in most areas of agriculture and mining, which allowed a growing working class of Spanish and mestizo farmers and citizens to find their place in Mexican colonial society. This society was defined largely by race. Peninsulares and Criollos sat at the top, followed by mestizos. Below them were the indigenous Mexicans, and at the bottom sat the African slaves. Power and wealth remained mostly in the hands of the Peninsulares and Criollos. By the mid-17th century, Mexico was a place of flourishing culture, with a growing artistic and architectural identity of its own. Grand new churches, like the Church of Santa Maria Tonantzintla in Puebla, demonstrated a new Baroque style, where European artists and religious influences blended with native handiwork to symbolize a new Mexican culture. Meanwhile, Mexican artists like Juana Inés de la Cruz, a nun, poet, and intellectual, contributed poems and literature to become founding figures of Mexico's own unique literary tradition. The rising Mexican identity coincided with the dwindling of the last independent native resistances, too. The last independent Maya city at Nopeten, in modern-day Guatemala, fell in March 1697. Still, native resistance did not entirely vanish. Through the latter half of the 17th century, the Tarahumara in Chihuahua and the Pueblo in New Mexico denied the Spanish the comfortable territorial control they craved. Now, with the wealth and culture of its own, and the indigenous communities sidelined or destroyed, Mexico had a growing sense of itself as a unique and distinct nation. Naturally, tension between this rising colonial society and its distant imperial master would emerge in time. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, colonial elites were less dependent on Spanish power, and the colonial administrators increasingly served the interest of local elites over imperial leaders. Spain was not ignorant of this growing rift. The Bourbon reforms of the mid-1700s, named for the Bourbon dynasty, who secured their power with the War of the Spanish Succession in 1715, attempted to reassert Spanish control. They took greater control of the taxes and coinage, modernized the military, and overhauled administration, signaling a new centralized age of Spanish control. Any obstacle to the crown's control were disposed of, such as the independently minded Jesuits, who were expelled from Mexico and the rest of Spanish America in 1767, and their missions taken over by the crown. The problem with centralization, however, is that it makes the entire empire vulnerable if the center is weak. And that's exactly what happened. Constant warfare on the European continent in the wake of the French Revolution in 1789 drained Spain's resources, making Spain more dependent on Mexican riches than Mexico was upon Spanish protection. Royal treasury debt almost tripled between 1791 and 1815, as Spanish fell into an irrecoverable financial spiral that made controlling Mexico all but impossible. Mexico itself was plagued by contrasts. Social unrest arising from wealth inequality, where beggars sat outside richly funded churches, paid for by generous local elites. Agriculture was most people's livelihood, and it was insecure, with crop failures and unreliable prices causing havoc and despair for Mexican farmers in the late 1700s. There was also great unrest thanks to ongoing tension with France and Britain that created demand for an army to defend Mexico that Spain could simply not afford. The Shatterpoint arrived in 1808 with Napoleon's invasion of Spain, which toppled the ruling Bourbons and left Mexico and the rest of Spanish America in a state of limbo. Mexico's vice-regal government refused to recognize the newly installed French usurper, but the legitimate King Ferdinand VII was unable to exercise any real authority either. Mexico's imperial master effectively collapsed for several years, leaving Mexico to fend for itself. Decades of Spanish mismanagement and a growing sense of Mexican identity combined to seize the opportunity this imperial weakness presented. On September 16, 1810, Father Miguel Hidalgo y Castilla gave a speech at Dolores, urging Mexico to throw off Spanish control and declare independence. He invoked Our Lady of Guadalupe, a uniquely Mexican vision of the Virgin Mary, as a rallying symbol for the fight. This was the spark that lit the fire of a revolutionary fight that would rage for the next decade. Hidalgo was captured and killed by the Mexican government the following year, but his message for independence was taken up by countless others. Another priest, José María Morelos, spearheaded a rebellion centered in southern Mexico. On November 6, 1813, he led the Congress of Anahuac to declare Mexican independence, and a year later drafted its first constitution. The Spanish refused to accept Morelos' declaration. With Ferdinand VII's restoration to the Spanish throne in 1814, he ordered fresh troops to Mexico, who defeated and captured Morelos, who was executed in December 1815. The torch of the revolution then passed to his second-in-command, Vincent Guerrero, who led the movement for the next 5 years. In 1820, however, policy changes in Spain towards a liberal, anti-clerical attitude turned conservative Mexicans against the Spanish crown. Agustin de Iturbide, commander of the Spanish crown's forces in Mexico, and the man tasked with the ongoing fight against Guerrero and the Republicans, opened secret negotiations with him instead. The two men agreed to declare Mexican independence with protections for Catholicism, racial equality, and the elimination of the Spanish crown's power. Lacking the resources to raise a new army, and lacking the support in Mexico to make such opposition worthwhile, Spanish authorities signed the Treaty of Cordoba on August 24, 1821, marking the end of Spanish rule in Mexico and the birth of an independent Mexico. There were many challenges for this new nation to conquer, but for the first time in 300 years, Mexico would face those challenges on its own terms. The independence fight had seen conservative monarchists like Agustin de Iturbide and Republican radicals like Vincent Guerrero join forces against Spain. But with their common enemy gone, it was only a matter of time before these two incompatible factions came to blows. Iturbide and the monarchists initially had the upper hand, declaring him Emperor Augustine I of the Mexican Empire in May 1822. Republicans and the Mexican Congress couldn't tolerate this for long, and when the emperor dismissed Congress to rule by decree in October 1822, they had their pretext for another revolt. Guerrero led the way, but another general named Antonio López de Santa Anna also became a powerful voice. Santa Anna rallied the Republicans around himself and pressured Augustine to resign in December 1822. The Mexican Empire was soon replaced by the First Mexican Republic, but it would be anything but smooth sailing. Over a decade of unrest and conflict had decimated Mexico's land and economy, and they had no experience in running a government. There were things to celebrate. A new constitution asserting the equality of all races in Mexico was implemented in 1824, and slavery was abolished in 1829. But the new nation was plagued with unrest. Power veered between the centralists, who favored a strong central government, and the federalists, who wanted more regional power. Standing amidst all of this was Santa Anna, a charismatic and intelligent man with national hero status and the loyalty of the army. His story was as turbulent as that of his early nation. He became president in 1833, and again in 1834, 1839, 1841, 1843, 1844, 1847, and 1853, each time exiled by political rivals, only to be ushered back in again soon after. Racked by political instability, Mexico was ill-equipped to deal with the external threats it faced, or the problems in the wider imperial territories it had inherited from Spain. Thanks to the Spanish Empire, Mexican territory extended as far as California, New Mexico, and Texas, but Mexican settlement there was low. Instead, it was American settlers who were fast transforming the population of these regions, and the Mexicans believed it was only a matter of time before the Americans in these territories tried to rebel. That is exactly what happened in Texas in 1835. Santa Anna marched north to put down the Texan Revolution that same year. He spared no quarter for the rebels. Famously, after the 13-day siege of the Alamo at San Antonio in February and March 1836, Santa Anna ordered the deaths of every defending soldier left in the Alamo. The brief taste of victory for Mexico turned bitter, as the Alamo became a rallying cry for the Texan rebels that only hardened their resistance. Weeks later, Santa Anna was defeated at the Battle of San Jacinto in April 1836, where he was captured by Texan forces and was forced to retreat, ending Mexican control of Texas. U.S. support for Texas enraged the Mexicans, as did the admission of Texas as a U.S. state in 1845. Mexico considered the annexation a virtual act of war. Both sides rushed troops to the border, and Mexican troops opened fire on American soldiers who had crossed into disputed territory, beginning the Mexican-American War. The war proved a disaster for Mexico. Small groups of Americans took New Mexico and California, while Santa Anna and the main Mexican forces tried to repulse a U.S. invasion from the north. After a series of defeats, most notably the Battle of Buena Vista in February 1847, the Americans opened a second front of the war by invading along the Gulf Coast. The Mexicans waged a losing fight against the Americans as they marched inland, resulting in the American siege and capture of Mexico City in September 1847. Mexico had no choice but to seek peace. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo permanently surrendered California and New Mexico to the United States and defined the border between the two great nations of North America. Defeat in the Mexican-American War was a sobering blow to the young nation. Santa Anna was scapegoated and experienced yet another period of exile, while reformers urged a change, a more powerful central government, separation of church and state, and a stronger justice system. The church and the military stood to lose out in these reforms, which compelled them to invite Santa Anna back for his final stint in power in 1853. Santa Anna's final presidential term was one of centralization. He expanded the army and made demands for a perpetual dictatorship that pushed things too far. In late 1854, liberal reformers launched a rebellion against him, ousting him for the final time, and seizing control of government with a new reforming zeal. The next few years were a period of change, known as the La Reforma. Under the successive liberal governments of Juan Alvarez, Ignacio Comonfort, and Benito Juarez, the remnants of Spanish colonialism were swept away, with a massive reduction in power of the church and military, protections for freedom of speech and the press, and the redistribution church land. This triggered a new civil war in 1857, known as the Reform War, with America backing the reformers, led by Benito Juarez, and most European powers sympathizing with the conservatives. The reformists prevailed in the resulting war, following the Battle of Calpulalpan in 1860. But that victory was short-lived thanks to the French, who invaded in 1862 and installed Maximilian I as emperor in Mexico City. Juarez and the Republicans continued a government from the north, in cities like El Paso del Norte, now Ciudad Juarez, while Maximilian spent 6 years ruling as a surprisingly liberal ruler, which cost him most of his conservative support. This Second Mexican Empire lasted only until 1867, when Republican rebels captured and executed Maximilian, and sent the French packing from the continent. Benito Juarez returned to the presidency to begin a period of recovery for Mexico. He worked on modernizing the economy by expanding the railways, reworking tariffs, adopting the metric system, and setting up telegraph networks for faster communication. He also finalized the firm separation between church and state that kept religion out of politics. By his death in 1872, he had enshrined himself as a national hero. In 1876, Juarez's successor, Sebastián Lerdo de Tejada, was overthrown in a rebellion led by Porfirio Díaz, who had installed himself as an effective dictator over Mexico. Liberty, order, and progress had been the watchwords of Juarez's age, but Díaz dropped it down to just order and progress. A loss of liberty was the price to be paid for the latter two, Díaz argued. Díaz surrounded himself with a circle of elite scientists, artists, economists, and other intellectuals, known as the Científicos, who advised him on the creation of what they thought would be a perfect society. Díaz's approach was pan o polo, bread or stick, where those who went along with his reform programs would be rewarded with privileges. Intellectuals could expect cushy jobs in the expanding bureaucracy, while military and religious elites could find favor by supporting Díaz's policies. Meanwhile, opponents of his rule faced exclusion, intimidation, arrest, and in some cases, execution. Through his bread and stick approach, Díaz secured his regime for 35 long years. In some ways, Díaz's policies were successful. Mexico did become much wealthier, and many hallmarks of modernity, like electricity and the oil industry, took off. But this new wealth was heavily concentrated in the elites. Regular people continued to be relatively poor, with few rights, long working hours, and a stagnant or declining standard of living that caused building resentment against the upper class. Díaz was popular at first, but as the unequal consequences of his policies became apparent later in his long reign, protest movements emerged. By 1900, radical groups like the anarchist regeneration movement of Ricardo Flores Magón agitated for resistance and the overthrow of the aging dictator. By 1908, Díaz was facing significant domestic and international criticism, which led him to make vague promises about transitioning back to democracy. Optimism for change was short-lived, though. In the lead-up to the promised 1910 election, it looked like the political outsider, Francisco Madero, would defeat Díaz's chosen candidate, so Díaz had Madero arrested. The Díaz-controlled Electoral College declared Díaz president again, but he did not anticipate Madero escaping jail and calling on his supporters to rise up in rebellion in October 1910. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 pitted Díaz's Federalist armies against the revolutionaries. Díaz's army was outdated, low on morale, and lacking experience, while the revolutionaries were animated with the fire of political revolution. After a series of stinging defeats, Díaz's army surrendered in May 1911, and Díaz himself finally resigned and fled to France. Díaz's fall was only the beginning of the chaos. The next few years of Mexican politics was a mess of conspiracy, short-lived governments, and civil war. Madero held the presidency for just 15 months before being overthrown and executed by the commander of his own military, Victoriano Huerta. Regional rebellions immediately erupted, and the US landed an occupation force at Veracruz to put pressure on Huerta to resign, which he did in July 1914. Unfortunately, the anti-Huerta factions immediately started fighting each other, triggering a new wave of open warfare and destruction that ripped across Mexico. Although civil war was still raging, by 1917, Venustiano Carranza had asserted himself as the president in practice and launched a new constitution to put his revolutionary ideals into practice. He ordered the redistribution of land away from the elites of Díaz's day, renewed restrictions on the church, established universal state-funded secular education, and protected the rights of workers through the enforcement of an 8-hour working day. The 1917 Constitution remains in place in Mexico to this day. Alas, Carranza didn't have the same staying power, toppled by his former ally, Álvaro Obregón, in 1920 and killed. Obregón's presidency marked the end of serious fighting, but a sort of soft revolution continued, as Obregón and his successors in the Institutional Revolutionary Party implemented a program of reform through the 20s and 30s. Most famously, the nationalization of Mexico's oil industry in 1938. The PRI would remain in power for many decades. After 1940, however, some of their policies did moderate, and the advent of World War II helped open a new chapter in Mexican history. Mexico was a vital supplier of raw materials to the United States, and with global industry oriented towards war instead of trade, Mexico experienced a rapid development of its own industries to fill the gap. Mexico declared war on Germany in 1942, following U-boat attacks on its ships, and sent fighter squadrons to fly missions in the Pacific Theater. But aside from the deaths of 7 pilots, the effects of World War II in Mexico were almost entirely positive. The industrial boom that the war inspired allowed Mexico to enter the post-war world with a thriving industry and soon a soaring population. Under the unbroken leadership of the PRI, Mexico experienced consistent economic and social advancement in the following years. Standards of living rose, voting rights were extended to women, and infrastructure projects, such as hydroelectric dams and airports, propelled Mexico into the modern age. However, the long reign of the PRI began hitting turbulence in the 1980s. Much of Mexico's prosperity rested upon the profits from its nationalized oil industry and massive international loans. But that left it vulnerable to the 1982 oil crisis, where oil prices collapsed, and Mexico struggled to cover its debts. Domestic economic problems, like high inflation and unemployment, undermined confidence in the PRI, and for the first time, serious political opposition emerged, with the Partido de la Revolución Democrática, PRD, on the left, and the Partido de Acción Popular, PAN, on the right. The government was racked by inefficiency, and nothing showed that more strongly than the Mexico City earthquake on September 19, 1985, which killed thousands of people and devastated the capital. The government's response was sluggish. Emergency relief was slow on the scene, and it took years to repair damage that other countries could repair in a fraction of the time. By the 1990s, change was needed. The PRI pivoted towards an aggressive free market economic strategy, such as joining the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, in 1992. But not everyone welcomed this shift. Most famously, the Zapatista National Liberation Army, believing that the PRI had betrayed the ideals that had placed it in power back in the 1920s, declared open rebellion in Chiapas and tried to found their own independent regional government. The Mexican government began an unpopular military campaign to shut down the rebellion, which not only failed to reassert government control, but led to hundreds of civilian deaths. Further cuts to government spending were deeply unpopular, and despite the economy starting to improve by the late 1990s, the PRI's reputation could not recover. In the 2000 presidential election, The PRI's 71-year rule came to an end with the election of the right-wing PAN candidate, Vincent Fox. For most people, though, the new government didn't really mean much change. Mexico stepped into the new millennium with a broad continuation of the policies and problems of the previous one, and the country continued to wrestle with inflation and unemployment with some success. If there's two problems that define Mexico for outsiders in the 21st century, it's the cartels and immigration. Cartels existed in Mexico for decades, but the collapse of their rivals elsewhere in Latin America through the 1990s allowed the Mexican cartels to fill the void. Then there's people migration. Every year, millions of Mexicans enter the United States legally and illegally, seeking a better life. And the Mexican border is the entry point for immigrants from elsewhere in Latin America and beyond. This movement into America has often been beneficial for Mexico, with immigrants sending money back to Mexico from higher-paying jobs. However, like many countries, Mexico struggles with so-called brain drain, where highly skilled people are likely to leave Mexico for better-paying work in the US, depriving it of valuable human capital. But while its problems are well known, Mexico's strengths are also apparent. As of 2025, it has the 10th largest population and 12th largest economy in the world, with most economists expecting it to enjoy significant growth in the coming decades. With this optimism for the future comes a pride in the past. Indigenous identification has risen from 13% in 2000 to over 19% in 2020. As more Mexicans embrace with the pride of their native heritage that had once been ignored, and modern archaeology continues to unravel the fascinating history of Mexico stretching back thousands of years.